Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Last time we built up our pattern pretty well, and this time we're going to be getting into some different distortion techniques. Thanks for staying with me so far, and let's get right into it. Right now we're sawing up our last four-way, and then we are going to polish the ends off and have a look and see what our picture looks like now. Okay, they've been cut up, ends ground to 120 grit, and etched. We got very nice squares, nice and crisp and sharp on the corners. And now we have a pattern of 8 links by 8 links. This is the final resolution for the pattern. We're going to be welding this together, but then the next time we cut it up, it'll just be to stack itself on top of itself a bunch of times this way. Boom, 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 boom. And then forge weld it down that way. To make it into a thick, wide stack for a feather cut. And we're just going to feather cut down what used to be this seam and drag all these ends of these links into the center of the pattern. But we're still getting good connections here. You can see. And it's going to be feather cut anyway, so the good connections are in a way almost wasted there. But the links themselves are still nice and distinct. We got a little bit of motion and wave to the chain. And I like that too. This stuff has been distorted down. You remember, one of these links used to be as big as nearly this whole thing before this was welded. And now they've been shrunk to 1/8 of the size of this thing. Well, in one direction and in the other direction. So they're really a 64th of the size of this whole picture, and yet they remain distinct links. I think we could get another connection or two out of them if we wanted to build up to a higher pattern density, but this is just right for seeing what we want to see, because this will actually present a little bit smaller in finished chef knives. You know, this is going to be crushed down to, oh, these are 1.5 inch squares almost, so this is about 3 inches. Now they get crushed down to about 2.25 to be shown in a chef knife blade, so it will be smaller even then. At any rate, let's stop talking about this. I'm going to go grind them, get them ready for the last four-way weld sequence, and we'll go from there. This being the first forging heat of this installment, I'm just going to leave the whole thing in here. It's just about a minute between coming out of the forge and going back in here. This is just knocking the welds shut for the first time. So I'm being pretty gentle about it. I'm flip-flopping it a lot. And what I try to do is not always rotate it in the same direction. You can see sometimes I flip it to counterclockwise. That way I'm kind of balancing any unwanted distortion a little bit more. And I'm also changing where it's sitting on the die depending on how it's looking. You develop a feel for that kind of after you observe how your particular hammer wants to rhombus things and what spots on the dies do what. But this one just stayed nice and square, and it was pretty manageable the whole time. So with this short heat, then we'll just get it right back in the forge. Make sure to soak it well and consolidate the welds not just with hammering but with some heat and grain growth. And heat number 2, and we're going to hit it a little bit harder this time, a little bit longer, and I'm going to go ahead and speed this one up now that you've observed the rhythm of the hammer and forging for one entire heat. Now as this heat progresses, you'll notice I'm starting to forge it into a rectangular shape. And I've been very careful that I know, and I've oriented my handle such that I know which way the chains are running, because now as it becomes rectangular, the chains need to be running left and right along the long axis of the billet for this thing to come out right for the feather cut. You can see it's turning rectangular right now. I think my camera cut off the end of this heat just as I was starting to straighten a little bit, but we'll show you a little bit more forging on the next clip. This will be the final heat on the hammer before we get to shape, and I'm trying to do real clean work, finish it up crisp on the hammer, have no rhombus whatsoever, observe everything well, because next we're going to be going to the rolling mill to get all the taper out of it. It's got to be clean at the end of this forging procedure. And I thought I'd show this too. At the end of the heat, I tend to go over to the rolling mill, put the billet through the rollers, bring down the top roller until it's snug on the billet. So I'm sizing the rollers for the billet, and then I'll just add a little bit of depth on that top roller for the next heat, and away we go. There's just a little give in the top roller the way this thing is built, so you just learn to roll it through and then back out again before you add depth on that roller. And another thing that I do is I keep my foot on the gas at all times, no matter what direction it's going. So while I'm actually adjusting the top roller down for the next pass, I'm already accelerating the drive. And that way I'm working most efficiently and taking the least amount of time. Because on the rolling mill, it's all about conserving heat. It cools down a lot quicker on the rolling mill than it does on the hammer. So you just got to develop little tricks. Now I'll just go run over to the hammer and take that little bend out real quick. Another heat on the roller. You'll notice I get the rollers going for a while before I feed the billet through. That way they get through the rollers quicker and get less heat sucked out of them. Now watch me flip it over before I put it back through. Add some roller, put it back through, flipped over. That way it tends to counterbalance the bending force that's exerted against it and keep the billet straighter longer. More little tricks you learn on the rolling mill. And that way, if the rollers have a little bit of difference in height from side to side of the top roller, that also gets balanced out. So that way you don't get the edge stretched out more than the edge on the other side and then create a banana, stuff like that. Little rolling mill tricks. And now we got this bad mama jama. Just a little bit over 18.5 in length. So that'll give us the ability to cut 9 2-inch long chunks and have room for blade kerfs and such. It is, gosh, only about 3/4 thick by about 2.5 wide. And we have cooled it fairly slowly, and now it's just air cooling the rest of the way. And next we'll be chopping it up. Stick with me now. All right, y'all, here we are sectioned up. We are 8 pieces tall. They are 2 1/4 long by 2.5 wide, I suppose. And I cut them all with a stop on the bandsaw, so they are exactly the same length as each other. They are rolled, so they are exactly the same height as each other. So we have good uniformity. I'm going to set these out on the chuck, grind all the mating surfaces, not the top of this one, not the bottom of this one. And the bar was marked from right to left, so the one here was closest to the handle. This side of it was the handle. And the left edge of the 8 here was closest to the tip of the billet. So I'm just going to keep that one buried where it'll become tang stock. I'm going to split it down this way. So the bottom of the entire split will be here. So if there's any, like, run out pattern down in here, it'd just be back in some tangs once I've sawed it into loaves. And same for the tip. If there's any weird distortion at the tip of this, which there shouldn't be, the end grain picture of this billet looked really nice when we put it together, but still, I am forging all of these to shape, not bird's beaking or anything, because that doesn't make much sense with a feather. So there will be distortion. I like the way that looks, and that should compensate for any weirdness in this top piece. At any rate, let's get to grinding on that. Well, this bar is still at a little taper. There's a high spot there. There's a low spot there. And we're going to need to keep grinding till we get those low spots cleaned up as good as the high spots are. Okay, well, we've got our 8 pieces stacked up directly on top of each other, everything clean and nice in between. So let's go ahead and do all the tack welding. To add a quick note here. Some of you guys that have done feather before may notice that I am not fully welding all the way around the seams on this, whether with TIG or MIG. I'm just tacking all the corners. I just want to do that to keep it together in the forge till I get a weld on it. But with a good soak in the forge after and during the welds, you should get enough aging of the weld that you don't need to worry about these ripping apart when you feather cut them. And actually, I want it to rip apart to show me that the weld is not that good. If it's going to, I'd rather do this in a cavalier fashion. Well, not cavalier, but a confident fashion, and see that my welds are solid enough without being what you would call dry welds, if that makes sense. You'll see it's sitting in the forge without a handle because I'll be doing this weld and cut with tongs, blacksmith style. So I'm using pickup tongs to handle this. I got a fire brick on the anvil to set it on so I can switch my grip once I pull it out the forge. And we are putting it under the steam hammer. Now you'll see the treadle is a little grumpy on this thing. It got up and went too quick. Now I'm going to have to kick it a few times to get it going. There we are. Nice thing about the steam hammer is it's got a much longer throw than the Baudry, so for a tall stack like this, it's pretty much my go-to for welding something like this up. And we are beating it down pretty hard just to get some consolidation on that first weld, so that when we get it back in the forge, we don't have any air gaps, and we can just go ahead and age it for a while. Here we go. Now that I had the height knocked down a little bit, I had gotten a little bit of rhombusing over on the steam hammer, so the first thing to do was to correct that. You see me tilting it a little on the tongs and forging the high corner down. So it was pretty easy to fix it from that one orientation. And then I had a little to take out the other way, so got to tumble it, shift my grip, got to keep in mind where the grain is on the side of the billet the whole time. And so you'll see me roll it up here and forge that corner down a little bit to square everything up finally. Everything's welded good, everything's square now. We're just going to crisp it up. You can see that we've actually knocked the height down quite a lot at this point. So now we just got to crisp the shape up. Now I'm still having to keep in mind very much the orientation and placement of the pattern on this billet. Always keeping it in mind whenever I tumble this. I'm just crisping up the corners. I don't really want any taper to it, especially for the split. I want all the pieces to be the same width. And you can see this is much squatter now than when we started as a tall stack. People want to split tall feathers, I think, especially the newer they are at it, but from what I've seen, it's easier to kind of pre-distort it down to a shorter squashed stack that's wider, split that, and then you can stretch it back out from that point into longer blades and still have it come out quite nice. After one more good 5-minute soak at a welding heat to grow that grain and age those welds, I'm just tapping a couple little more crisp corners into it, and then we're going to call it good. Next we'll be feathering it on the press. And here we go. I have a foot pedal on the press to control it. And you'll see my feather cutter isn't quite as deep as the billet or wide as the billet, so I'm going to have to alternate front and the back of the stack, chop a little, move it, chop a little, and you can totally do that as long as they roughly keep up with each other. See, I got a hammer there for just getting it unstuck every now and then. You could use a punch lube like Fuchs lube or a little bit of coal dust or something, but I just tend to be a little conservative, not overheat the edge, and go ahead and drop my hammer on the floor and have to pick it up and have a little comedy of errors and smack it off there every time. I don't get in a hurry when I'm splitting a feather. If I need to take a heat or two, maybe 2-3 heats to get all the way through it, fine. It's better than making a mistake trying to cut it too cold, ripping something apart, because we have so much work into this thing at this point. So let's take another heat as soon as we get the back of that cut apart. And we're back with a fresh heat. We're going to continue splitting this. We got about halfway through the first time. Just carefully making our way down slow, watching the corners, keeping the front of the cut up with the back of the cut. Keep it knocked off of there. This is an H13 feather cutter, but I forgot to heat treat it before I tacked it to the base plate, so it doesn't have quite the heat resistance that it ought to. One of these days I'm going to take it back off there, heat treat it, put it back on, but for now I just kind of baby it so it doesn't weld itself to the billet. And we're getting down through, we're almost done with the cut now. I'm kind of working on the very bottom. I like controlling it in tongs as I go. That's kind of like, Dave Leash recommended it to me, doing it that way years ago, and he's done a lot more feather than I have, and so I try to take good advice when I get it from guys that are experienced, and so I have just gone kind of the blacksmith's way with it too. That way I can put a wedge under it and actually control the direction of the split a little bit, manipulate it with tongs in case it gets off kilter a little bit, rather than being married to a handle on top of a spatula with a flat bottom or something. Everyone's got a little bit different of a way, but this way works for me. Anyway, so we have gotten down to the bottom of our cut. I'm just leaving a little hinge, but now we'll just go cut it apart with an angle grinder. Okay, well, I split it with the angle grinder, but the footage got weirdly compressed, so I had to toss that out. Here you see the result. 2 pretty equal halves, just split basically at the root of that cut, ready for subsequent forging. Now, of course, some of that distortion we want to keep, i.e. the smear cut, but some of it we don't want to keep, i.e. the kind of smeared shape, lack of orthogonal reference points and square edges. The feather cut has kind of like dragged it a little bit parallelogram, and so we're just going to tumble it around with the tongs with some good heat and just forge it flat and square again without really changing the dimensions too much. We're going to do that with both pieces and get them to match as much as we possibly can, so we have as little grinding that we have to do before they are ready to forge weld back together. All right, guys. Well, by far the most stressful part of this entire billet manufacturing process is now done. And these, you can see I freeform forged them under the hammer, just with pickup tongs, basically, to have flat sides that'll mate up well, be the same height as each other, and be the same width as each other. Now you can see the matching pattern on the faces of those. They're being dragged down toward the center. So that's good. One of them is a little bit bigger than the other. Very common thing with feathers. Sometimes it's a horrible, catastrophic inequality, but this one is not really a problem at all. I will tend to just bias one side toward the edge more so it gets drawn out more on finished knives. But this almost is totally even. Anyway, we'll just be grinding the inside faces of that clean, nice and clean, because they're going to get welded back together as the final step of hot work. So we'll fire up the surface grinder once these cool down, or maybe just do it on the broad deck. We'll just have to see. Anyway, thanks for staying with me this far. Good to have that done. Whew.